All right, everybody, we are back for the second half of our section on policy evaluation. And here we're just going to talk about some basic designs and some challenges for how the policy evaluation process might work. Now, the gold standard for any policy evaluation is what's called an experiment or a true experiment, right? And in this case, we draw a sample, whether it's a sample of counties or a sample of people or a sample of prisons or a sample of whatever, sample of crimes. Then, importantly, we randomly assign some percentage of that sample to one group and randomly assign the other part of that sample to another group. Then one group gets some treatment, some change, something, right? In this case, it's usually going to be the implementation or the result of some policy. Whereas the other group doesn't get that effect or policy or treatment, right? And then we measure the difference in the thing we're trying to change, right? So we have some comparison to know what would have happened without that treatment. And because we use that random assignment to one group or the other, we can kind of assume or control for any differences between the two groups in the beginning. So we can kind of assume if we did this sampling and we did the random assignment correctly, mathematically, we can assume that at the beginning that experimental group and the control group were the same. And so any effects we see at the end of this process are a result of the treatment and not just some random difference that's always existed, right? Unfortunately, this is usually very time-consuming, very expensive, and has other issues, especially in the field of criminal justice, because of that whole random assignment part. It can be very difficult to randomly assign whatever you're sampling in the criminal justice field for various legal, ethical reasons, right? So, for instance, if we wanted to do a juvenile treatment program for juvenile offenders to try to reduce their recidivism rates, it would be legally and ethically questionable, if not outright impossible, to randomly sentence juvenile offenders to either a treatment program or the alternative, which is probably, juvenile detention or some sort of other incarceration, for what I hope are pretty obvious reasons. So this random assignment, while it is possible in many instances for policy evaluation, is not always legally, financially, or ethically possible. So, another thing we can do is what's called the quasi-experiment. And this is essentially the same thing as the experiment we just talked about, with the only difference that the groups are not randomly assigned. So we can't assume that the two groups are the same at the beginning. Now, there are some things we can do, some measures we can take to try to help ensure that they are as close to equivalent as possible. You can do matching, either group matching or individual matching. If you want to learn more about how we can kind of improve the quality of these quasi-experiments, please take my research methods course. It is also available. So these quasi-experiments, while they're not as scientifically prestigious as the true experiments, they can be very important and very impactful and just as high quality as true experiments. It just takes a different kind of effort, if that makes sense. And these are much more common especially in the field of criminal justice, where that random assignment is often a legal or ethical or just physical difficulty or even impossibility. Now, the third kind of program we're going to talk about is very simple, and it's just a before and after, right? So we pass a new state law in the state of Oregon that is intended to reduce homelessness or drug use or child poverty or whatever. That policy gets implemented, and then we just look at, well, here's the measure of whatever that problem was for the year or 2 years or 5 years or 10 years before the policy was implemented, and here's what it looked like after. Now, in many cases, this can be, scientifically rigorous and perfectly valid. The problem here is it can be very difficult to determine what's called the counterfactual, i.e., what would have happened otherwise, right? Just because homelessness is down in the after scenario compared to where it was in the before scenario doesn't necessarily mean it was due to your reduction in homeless policy that you just passed. It could be a complete fluke. It could be random variation. It could be some different national policy. It could be any one of a number of other things. But again, there are kind of methods we can use to try to narrow down the causes of any difference in the before and after. Okay? Once again, if you want to know more about this, please take my research methods course. All right, so challenges. What makes evaluating policies difficult? Well, this is not a complete list, but for one thing, there's unclear goals, right? If a policy is designed to reduce crime, okay, we have a lot of those. But is the policy designed to reduce all crime or just property crime or just violent crime? Is it designed to, is a reduction of 5% or 10% count as a success? Is a policy that's designed to increase educational attainment? Is the goal there to reduce the high school dropout rate? Improve the average GPA? Is it to increase the number of high school students who later go on to college? Is it, what's the actual goal there? It can also be very challenging to determine causation. As we discussed in those previous slides, just because you changed a policy and you saw a difference afterwards doesn't necessarily mean that the difference you saw was due to your policy. There are other things that can change whatever effect it is you're trying to measure. So actually establishing that it was your policy or your change or your thing that you did that actually caused that difference that you observed at the end can be very difficult. Sometimes it's relatively easy. Sometimes it's darn near impossible. It can be very difficult to gather data, right? For lots of various reasons. In the field of cybercrime, it can be incredibly difficult to measure the number of victims of cybercrime just because so many victims either don't know they were a victim or they don't report or they try to keep things quiet. Like if a business is hit by a cyber attack, they might never tell anybody because they think it will hurt their stock price. So researchers have no way of knowing that they were a victim. Other times it can be things like, data about crime and criminal activity might not be released until 6 months or a year or 2 years after it's, this year's information might not get released until next year. There's often official resistance to policy evaluations because officials and organizations have kind of vested interests in certain policies succeeding. So they might be resistant to you evaluating it because they're afraid if you find that it either is not effective or isn't effective enough, they could lose the money or power or employment or whatever it is that they're getting that benefits them with the presence of that policy, right? So like the death penalty. Research has shown over and over that it has no deterrent effect, that it costs more than life in prison without parole, but there is still official resistance to getting rid of the death penalty, even though the evaluations are very clear, because the people in charge want votes. They want people to vote for them. And so they don't care what the policy evaluation says, they care what the voters want, right? There's also short-term thinking. If a policy doesn't have an immediate effect, well, then it's useless. Get rid of it. Let's measure the 1-year reduction in recidivism rates, or even the 2 or 3 year reduction in recidivism rates from this prison rehabilitation program, when the positive effects of that program might not be evident until 5 years or 6 years or 10 years later, right? So this focus on the short term and the focus on immediate results really kind of hinders accurate, full evaluations of any given policy. There can be a lack of impact. We might have some policy evaluation that we're very confident this policy is great, but nobody listens. Or there might be study after study and evaluation after evaluation that says that it doesn't do anything, this policy is terrible, and nobody reads it. Nobody cares. Nobody, the people who make decisions about policies have some other reason for either continuing or not continuing or implementing or not implementing any given policy. And then finally, there's the ethical issue of just assigning dollar values, right? Especially, sometimes it's easy. You make widgets in a factory, you do something to change how many widgets you make. It's a simple calculation for did that change increase or decrease the amount of money we can make and the amount of widgets we can put out per hour. Sometimes it's very clear, but other times it's not so clear, especially when talking about things like human life. A car company might say, okay, the dollar cost for implementing this safety feature in next year's model of our automobile is X amount of dollars, but it's going to save this amount of lives. Well, is that amount of dollars worth that amount of lives? Is a $10 million program that reduces heroin use by 20% worth it? I mean, we have to assign a dollar value to the suffering and pain and death and associated crime that heroin use has. And that can be incredibly difficult and incredibly kind of morally and ethically questionable. All right, well, that is the end of this section. Thank you so much for watching. If you are still there, please know that I very much appreciate your viewing this. Please check out my other courses, my other lectures, my other sections. I am sure that there's something else out there. If this video was something you enjoyed, I assure you there's something else out there from me that you will also enjoy. So thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next one.